present, hyper-present and attentive father. I communicate well with my kids. I really try to foster empathy in my children and have them understand the concept and use it practically in the world, because I think empathy should be taught in schools. Let's focus on that. Like, I think the world would be a different place if we did that.
Today was the day Wayfair went to court to argue its motion for summary judgment. I followed the hearing through live tweets since I couldn't be there in person, and I'm grateful to the content creators who attended and will be able to report directly. Based on what I've seen, I don't believe there's going to be much of a trial, if any at all. The judge appeared to focus heavily on whether Blake Lively's claims had an actual legal basis, specifically whether her sexual harassment and retaliation claims were grounded in legal precedent and authority. From everything presented, it doesn't seem that they are. Notably, the hearing barely addressed damages, which is supposedly the entire reason the court is here in the first place. Damages to Betty Buzz and to Blake Brown. There was also no real discussion of the other women involved, likely because that would be impermissible propensity evidence, and much of what Blake raised in her response to the motion for summary judgment wasn't even included in her original complaint. The judge also spent little time on the Jamie Heath trailer incident or the birth video. Ultimately, Blake's argument that she must give consent to everything simply does not appear to meet legal standards. So the question becomes, why bring this case at all? If there's one conclusion to draw, it's Ryan Reynolds. Blake Lively appears to have a husband who controls nearly every aspect of her professional life, presenting her as the writer of content and scripts while allegedly doing the writing himself, working directly with her agents and speaking to WME and Sony on her behalf. It appears that Reynolds not only controls his own career, but also dominates his wife's. Blake's text messages suggest she often regurgitates his language verbatim. Richard Fadak once told me that Blake is not intelligent enough to operate at Brian's level, describing her as a parrot and a puppet of Ryan. While Blake may be manipulative in her own right, her model is Reynolds, whom she seems to view as all-knowing, and this case appears to reflect that dynamic. He portrays himself to her as almost godlike. Text messages Ryan Reynolds sent in August 2024, particularly one to Colleen Hoover, reveal his mindset and, in my view, explain why we're here today. In that message, Reynolds wrote, "What a complete win this is. I know we all breathe rare air and I realize how lucky we are, but I also know how genuinely good you and me are, and seeing good people put shitty people over their knees for a good old-fashioned pants-down spanking in the supermarket is a special experience I don't take for granted." This is the same man who publicly claims to care about victims of sexual harassment, yet he uses a metaphor centered on public humiliation, suggesting that Blake and Colleen were metaphorically pulling Justin's pants down and spanking him in public. That language matters. It reveals enjoyment, not justice. He takes pleasure in humiliation, in scolding, in berating, and in watching others suffer, all while justifying it through a self-assigned moral hierarchy. We're the good ones, they're the bad ones, so this is deserved. That is not the mindset of someone seeking resolution or common ground. It's the mindset of someone who revels in punishment and public shame. Even if you assume, for the sake of argument, that Blake and Colleen truly believed harm occurred, the idea that they would enjoy publicly humiliating someone in this way is absurd. The underlying justification collapses under its own weight. Being called hot in a costume does not warrant a metaphorical public spanking. And yet, this framing, this appetite for humiliation, is exactly why we're here. It's not about accountability or healing, it's about domination and spectacle, as revealed plainly in the communications themselves. Colleen Hoover is an integral figure in understanding how control over the film ultimately shifted. She aligned herself with Blake early on, and the two communicated frequently. So frequently, in fact, that many of their text messages are now part of the court docket. In July, Colleen relayed to Blake something she had heard from an agent, a comment that clearly upset Blake. Blake responded by saying, "That agent thing made me feel so crappy." Colleen apologized, saying she shouldn't have told her, but Blake reassured her it was fine and said she was glad she knew. What followed, however, was a long message that reveals far more than hurt feelings. Blake claimed that despite Justin's disturbing behavior, she still felt bad for him, even while accusing him of smearing her daily for asking him not to sexually or emotionally harass her, for trying to make his movie better, for calling in favors from major musicians and entertainers, and for essentially running a marketing campaign for free. She stated she couldn't identify a single thing she had done that justified the alleged smearing, asserting that Ryan Reynolds believed Justin should be writing her apology and thank you letters every day, instead of turning her into a monster. Blake framed herself as entirely work-focused, claiming she gave Justin every opportunity to succeed while accusing him of behaving like a rabid pig. She then escalated the narrative further by introducing what she characterized as a new form of harassment, emotional harassment. Yet this framing begins to unravel when you examine the broader context. According to Blake's own conduct, her involvement with the music and promotional efforts wasn't purely altruistic or about improving the film. It appears tied to securing PGA credit. Blake clearly did not view Justin as operating on her level. Her opinion of him was dismissive at best. Evidence of this mindset appears in notes she prepared for Angie Janetti in June 2023, before any formal sexual harassment claims were raised. That call was not about harassment at all. It was about strategy, how to run the set more efficiently, how to improve operations, and how to fix what Blake described as an amateur director, an amateur first AD, and an amateur producer. Her solution wasn't accountability for misconduct, it was replacement, get someone better. That distinction matters because it shows that at the time, Blake's concern wasn't safety or harassment, it was control, hierarchy, and perceived competence. The sexual harassment narrative came later, after frustrations over authority, credit, and creative dominance had already taken root. I just received a letter from Lisa, the post-production supervisor, and it underscores an important point. Despite all the distractions and chaos, some things can't be taken away, like her own sense of engagement and contribution. Around July 12th, even Colleen shared something from the Duma account that raised questions about Blake unfollowing people, being left out of the premiere, and being excluded from promotion. This was well before the so-called orchestrated smear campaign, which, according to Judge Liman, he didn't take seriously. He wasn't interested in the idea of a new form of retaliation, so it's likely any claims about a digital campaign will be dismissed. Blake seems to have a low tolerance for criticism and doesn't appear to want Justin to receive any recognition for his work. She believes her contributions improved the project, and in her mind justifies her actions. Justin has reportedly said he believes they truly believe they are right, because they are delusional and paranoid. In my view, Blake likely never believed she was sexually harassed. The evidence suggests
the criticism they received, he insisted, was real, coming from actual survivors, not bots, and it targeted Blake specifically for how she presented the film. Reynolds demanded that Sony step up for real and frame the narrative properly, arguing that if they didn't, the threat of exposure and backlash would only grow. He expressed that the situation put them against the wall and implied that failure to act could lead to public retaliation. Meanwhile, concerns about safety on set were real. An assistant director was reportedly fired for not keeping people safe, and Reynolds blamed Blake for negligence in almost every area, which he believed contributed to the dark behavior and tensions other women endured. According to reports, this firing and safety oversight were even discussed in relation to a return-to-work plan, showing the ongoing operational and interpersonal chaos that, in Reynolds' view, justified his anger and intervention. The escalation continued with what Reynolds described as the backlash to the backlash. He was reportedly prepared to go after Baldoni because he felt the marketing was being unfairly criticized and because stories about Blake firing people were being circulated. His WME agent confirmed that, on paper, Blake had indeed pushed for the assistant director's firing, but Sony and Wayfair refused to go on record due to liability concerns. Reynolds blamed Baldoni entirely for the issues, framing everything as a personal attack on Blake, and believed the studio's inaction showed a lack of accountability. Reynolds also focused on interviews and media coverage, particularly moments where Blake appeared to make minor mistakes or jokes. He argued that sections of her interviews had been isolated and amplified, creating a misleading narrative that caused Blake to unfairly blame herself. According to reports, she might have taken responsibility if her husband had not repeatedly assured her that she had done nothing wrong. Reynolds viewed the studio's responses as bland and insufficiently forceful, insisting that Sony and Wayfair acknowledge the broader cultural conversation and coordinate with his crisis management team. This was reportedly the first time that a major studio refused to acquiesce to their demands, which fueled their full-scale reaction. The judge, reviewing all this evidence, is tasked with applying the law, not feelings of discomfort or subjective hurt. Past cases, such as Baldoni's, show that even clear evidence of conflict and tension does not necessarily constitute illegal sexual harassment or retaliation. Claims framed as a new form of retaliation do not hold legal weight. Based on the evidence and legal standards, it appears likely that the judge will dismiss most, if not all, of these claims. While the interpersonal dynamics and behind-the-scenes chaos may be dramatic, they do not meet the objective legal criteria for sexual harassment or retaliation.
It was fabricated. For example, on August 29th, Blake sent a text to her agent regarding the dailies. She wanted to see them but was told no. She wrote, "Yikes, maybe he should send me the whole assembly then, because what I saw was terrifying. It made me want to get out of the movie. Totally. That's why I think you should see it. Let's discuss tomorrow." She expressed frustration that she wasn't allowed to see more dailies, claiming she was an executive producer and needed to be engaged during production and press. Her messages make clear this wasn't about sexual harassment or HR, it was about control and access. Blake was contractually limited in what she could see and do, and her repeated requests to view the dailies were strategic attempts to gain control. Her frustration with being excluded, the repeated denials, and her insistence on full access illustrate that this was about asserting authority, not reporting misconduct. She coordinated with colleagues, shared memes, and kept HR reports ready, not for protection from harassment, but to leverage her position. From the start, she did not have control. She was only an executive producer. Her actions around contracts and nudity writers were similarly strategic, aimed at consolidating influence. This was orchestrated from day one, and the record shows she was not discussing sexual harassment. She was seeking to insert herself into the process she wasn't entitled to under her contract. Even people within production rarely get to see cuts of a film before release because of spoilers, and yet Blake repeatedly shared dailies with everyone, disregarding NDAs associated with the project. She wasn't acting out of concern for HR. Her actions were about control. Her repeated comments like, "I have my HR thing ready," were strategic, aimed at gaining edit access and influence over the film. It's doubtful she's been allowed to see dailies or sit in the editing room for every project she's worked on. If that were standard, why didn't Paul Feig grant her a producer PGA credit? He didn't. She only pursued these actions against Justin because, in her view, he was an amateur. Blake's claims of sexual harassment don't hold up under legal scrutiny. During oral arguments, the judge asked whether a director could instruct actors to touch each other differently than what's in the script. Lively's lawyers said, not without consent. But the court pushed further, asking whether the involvement of intimacy coordinators or nudity writers is legally required. The answer is no. Courts do not enforce industry customs, best practices, union norms, or moral expectations. These roles, while standard in some productions, do not carry legal weight, so the case cannot rely on them to establish sexual harassment. The judge focused heavily on the contract, signaling that he views this more as a contract dispute than a harassment case. Regarding retaliation, most claims are also likely to be dismissed. For example, her lawyers argued that consent must be given, yet when pressed about dance scenes or minor directional adjustments, they insisted on a purely subjective standard. If Blake didn't like it, it's unlawful. The judge, however, is looking for an objective legal standard. Behavior must violate clear legal rules, not just personal feelings. Subjective reactions alone cannot form the basis of a claim under Title VII or related statutes, which is why her sexual harassment claims face serious hurdles. Blake's team didn't even attempt to argue FIEHA in the motion for summary judgment, which the judge clearly noted. He also seemed skeptical of the 17-point agreement that Blake and her team drafted because they couldn't see the dailies, which focused heavily on scenes with sexual content. In court, the discussion repeatedly came back to consent. Lively's lawyer argued that the only way to ensure scenes were acceptable was to obtain consent. The judge pushed back, asking whether suggesting more graphic scenes could be considered harassment. Her lawyer responded that Blake had signed a specific script that reflected her expectations, but when changes were made by Mr. Baldoni, she claimed harassment. The judge's point was clear. Personal feelings about changes to a script or scene, even if Blake felt harassed emotionally or sexually, do not in themselves meet the legal definition of sexual harassment. Blake wanted her feelings to be treated as law, but under the legal framework, her subjective discomfort does not constitute harassment. The judge was also unmoved by Blake Lively's attempts to involve other women in the case, which her attorneys admitted. According to her lawyer, the author of the book noted that certain sexualized scenes, like crawling toward Justin Baldoni for oral sex and climaxing together, were not part of her intent, but were added by Baldoni. The judge pushed back. "You have brought up other women." Lively responded, "It's evidence." He clarified that these references amounted to impermissible propensity evidence, since no other women were suing him, and their opinions or experiences were legally irrelevant to this case. Lively's attorneys tried to cite Jenny Slade and Isabella Ferrer, but the judge rejected the comparison, noting that those situations involved different facts and the women themselves were not claiming harassment in this case. It became clear that Blake's team anticipated losing on sexual harassment. They attempted to frame a hostile work environment by invoking other women, but when pressed, they abandoned the argument. Under Rule 404, propensity evidence, using past behavior to suggest a pattern, cannot be used to frame character without proper legal basis. Her team didn't even cite any laws or cases and could not counter the judge's points, effectively leaving the sexual harassment claims unsupported. Then they shifted to retaliation, arguing that Baldoni's supposed huffiness when she raised issues constituted retaliation, and presented a protection document. To support this, even here, within the legal framework of retaliation, the judge framed it as a contract issue rather than actionable harassment or retaliation, further weakening her case. Towards the end, they almost abandoned the retaliation claims entirely because the judge made it clear he did not want to rule on a new form of retaliation. From the evidence, it seems the judge does not believe that what happened on set rises to the level of sexual harassment.
This appears to be a conflict between two people who didn't get along, in which Blake willed herself into control and used her discomforts to claim harassment. Many observers, including myself, believe the driving force behind this litigation is Ryan Reynolds, who appears motivated by revenge. He reportedly wanted to punish people for enjoying the film's accolades without backlash. In a text from August 12th, he wrote, "I can't and won't sit by and watch my wife, who's been asked to shapeshift around a problematic man since the very beginning of this movie, complete a grand slam home run, only to be dragged through the mud while people rang the shame bell behind her. And besides me and her, nobody seems willing to have an uncomfortable conversation on her behalf or on mine." He pushed for Sony and Baldoni to release statements defending Blake, insisting that everyone should publicly support her while maintaining zero accountability for their own choices. Baldoni reportedly saw the film for the first time at the premiere, despite working on the edits, highlighting the chaotic and dysfunctional nature of the production. Blake and Reynolds, in their own minds, blamed others, Sony, Wayfair, and the crew, for the backlash, when in reality it was a direct result of Blake's actions. Sony executives allegedly viewed her behavior as toxic, labeling her as a terrorist for how she treated people behind the scenes. Reynolds then used this as evidence that others were against him, further framing the situation as a manufactured conspiracy. This context makes clear why the retaliation claims are weak. Reynolds and Blake's behavior created most of the chaos, and any reaction from Baldoni or the studio was framed as a retaliatory act. In reality, it was the predictable response to her interference, control, and repeated threats. All of the obstacles, landmines, and conflicts in the production appear to stem from Blake's actions, not from Baldoni, and the narrative of harassment or retaliation seems largely constructed to justify her behavior and Reynolds' desire to assert dominance over those involved. What Ryan Reynolds wants and why he's pursuing this case boils down to revenge and anger. He wants people to take responsibility, he wants them to face backlash, and he's furious that they refuse to comply with his demands. On set, his behavior reportedly unnerved multiple cast and crew members, including incidents where he acted inappropriately. For example, he reportedly bit an actor's lip during a kissing scene without prior discussion, one of several uncomfortable moments. Complicating matters further, there were competing cuts of the film. One version allegedly included a simulated sexual act involving a 15-year-old character, which was neither in the book nor the original script. This reinforced concerns about his male gaze dominating a story about domestic violence, which the production team intended to present thoughtfully. Blake Lively's involvement is similarly framed in public narratives as protective or heroic, but the evidence suggests otherwise. According to Reynolds, the only reason Blake took a cut of the film was to intervene in that controversial scene, yet the theatrical release still included that moment, and there was no actual nudity or penetration. The reality is that the story of saving women was used strategically to justify her takeover of the film. She coordinated timelines to align with her other projects, such as launching her hair care brand in August, and leveraged her executive producer role to influence the cut, choices that were intentional and self-serving rather than purely protective. Reynolds also criticized how Sony communicated about the situation. When Sony executives released statements that framed the narrative cautiously, he pushed for more direct messaging, insisting that the statements go straight at this rather than thread the needle. According to reports, he viewed these actions as part of controlling the narrative around the film, ensuring that both Blake and he were portrayed in the most favorable light, while holding others accountable for their choices. Ryan Reynolds' anger escalated around what he saw as failures in the marketing of the film, and it appears he viewed much of the situation as a coordinated attack on Blake. According to reports, he considered the backlash wrong and untrue, dismissing it as part of a systemic, orchestrated campaign by a crisis PR team, but he refused to accept that the criticism reflected reality. He was particularly frustrated that Blake was allowed to take part in the marketing, which he considered unforgivable, and that Sony would not publicly back her or take responsibility for the messaging he had designed. In texts to his team, Reynolds complained that the Hollywood Reporter's coverage was a joke and emphasized that the marketing of a wide theatrical release is a complex process led by studio teams influenced by research and executed internationally. He argued that the film was meant to highlight female triumph, not trauma, and any missteps in messaging should have been handled by Sony or Wayfair. Reynolds' frustration stemmed from a belief that the marketing, his idea, was under attack. He wanted the studio to take responsibility, but Blake and he refused to listen to market research or guidance from Sony, which tried to advise them on promotion strategies, messaging, and how Blake could address criticism during interviews.